The old riverside chapel had been rotting for 15 years when Thomas Mitchell first spotted the figures on the roof. Tucked away on the edge of his sprawling Utah property, the abandoned Mormon church was supposed to be demolished next week to make room for his luxury resort expansion. But there they were, an elderly man and woman, maybe 70s, hammering new shingles like their lives depended on it. Thomas had spent decades building his empire, transforming from a broke farm kid into one of Utah's wealthiest developers. He owned half the county now, including this worthless piece of church property that the community had finally agreed to sell. The demolition permits were signed, the bulldozers were scheduled. So who were these trespassers, and why did something about the woman's silver hair make his chest tighten with a forgotten ache? As Thomas approached the couple, the woman turned toward him, and her face stopped his heart cold. Those eyes, that gentle smile he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. But how could she be here when she was supposed to be dead? Thomas stood frozen beside his Range Rover, his expensive Italian shoes sinking into the overgrown grass. The woman's hammer paused mid-swing as their eyes met across the yard. Even from this distance, he could see the recognition flicker across her weathered features. She said something to the man beside her, her husband, Thomas assumed, and slowly began climbing down the ladder. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to call security, then stopped. What would he tell them? That he was seeing ghosts? That the woman who'd broken his heart 3 decades ago was somehow standing in front of him, alive and well, when her obituary had been in the Salt Lake Tribune in 1995? Thomas? Her voice carried across the yard, soft and uncertain. Thomas Mitchell. He forced himself to walk forward, each step feeling like he was moving through quicksand. Up close, she looked exactly as he'd imagined she would. Silver streaks threading through hair that had once been golden, laugh lines etched around eyes that still held that same warmth he remembered. But she was older, changed, real. "You're supposed to be dead." The words came out harsher than he intended. She winced. "I know how this must look. Do you?" Thomas felt 30 years of buried pain surge to the surface. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? What you put everyone through?" The man on the roof had climbed down now, positioning himself protectively beside the woman. Thomas recognized him vaguely, Robert something from the old ward, the man who'd married Sarah just 6 months after she'd broken their engagement. "We can explain," Robert said quietly. "Can you?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Can you explain why I went to your funeral? Why I watched them lower an empty casket while you were apparently alive somewhere? Can you explain why my mother died thinking she'd lost you forever?" Sarah's face crumpled. "Your mother? When did she?" 10 years ago. Cancer." Thomas's voice was ice. "She never got over losing you, her only daughter." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah staggered backward, and Robert caught her arm. "Daughter?" Robert looked confused. "Sarah, what is he talking about?" Thomas studied Robert's face and realized with shocking clarity that the man genuinely didn't know. After all these years, Sarah still hadn't told him the truth about who she really was. "You didn't tell him. It wasn't a question." Sarah's silence was answer enough. The pieces of the puzzle Thomas had carried for 30 years suddenly shifted, revealing a picture he'd never considered. If Sarah had faked her death, if she'd been hiding all this time, there could only be one reason, only one secret dark enough to make someone disappear completely. "My God." His voice was barely a whisper. "You know what happened that night, don't you? You know what really happened to Daniel?" Sarah's face went white. "Thomas, please." "All this time I thought you'd run away because you couldn't handle the investigation, the questions. But that wasn't it at all." Understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. "You didn't run because you were scared. You ran because you were protecting someone." Robert looked between them, completely lost. "Who's Daniel? Sarah, what is going on?" Thomas felt everything he'd built, everything he'd convinced himself was true, beginning to crumble. His brother Daniel's death had been ruled an accident. The family had grieved, moved on, built a fortune on the insurance money. But if Sarah knew something else, If she'd been hiding for 30 years because of what she'd witnessed that night? The resort, he said slowly. You're here because of the resort, because tearing down this church means disturbing the foundation, means digging up what's buried underneath. Sarah's tears confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. His brother Daniel wasn't buried in the family plot at all. Thomas spent the rest of the evening pacing his study, whiskey glass in hand, unable to shake the image of those weathered faces in the candlelight. The old man's eyes had held something that made his skin crawl, not fear but recognition, as if he knew exactly who Thomas was. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was nothing more than vagrant squatters who'd heard his name around town. Still, when he called his foreman, Jake Henderson, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there in years. "I want you to check the old church property," Thomas said, staring out his office window toward the distant spire barely visible through the oak trees. "Make sure those trespassers moved on." Jake's gravelly voice crackled through the phone. "Want me to call Sheriff Morrison if they're still there?" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "Just observe. Report back to me directly." After hanging up, Thomas tried to focus on the stack of contracts requiring his attention. The Mitchell Development Group had 3 major projects breaking ground this quarter, including the luxury resort that would replace the church and surrounding acres. Everything was proceeding according to plan, had been for months. So why did his hands shake as he reached for his coffee? The call came 2 hours later. "They're still there, Mr. Mitchell." Jake's tone was puzzled. "Been watching for an hour. They're working on the roof, patching holes with old shingles they must have found somewhere. Moving pretty well for folks their age." "You sure you don't want me to run them off?" Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "Did you get a good look at them?" "Well enough. Old man's maybe 75, still got some muscle on him. Woman smaller, grey hair in a bun, dressed poor but clean. Thing is—" Jake paused. "I could swear I've seen the old man somewhere before but can't place where." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His mouth went dry. "I'll handle this myself. Don't mention this to anyone else." "But sir—" "Anyone, Jake. That's an order." Thomas ended the call and sat in the sudden silence of his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Awards, photographs with politicians and business leaders, architectural models of future developments. 30 years of building an empire, of making the Mitchell name synonymous with progress and prosperity in this corner of North Carolina. All of it threatened by 2 old people fixing a roof. He pulled open his desk drawer and extracted a key he hadn't used in 15 years. Behind a hidden panel in his office wall sat a small safe containing documents that should have been destroyed decades ago. His fingers trembled as he worked the combination. Inside lay a manila folder, its edges yellow with age. Thomas stared at it for a long moment before lifting the cover. The first document was a birth certificate dated 51 years ago. His birth certificate, but not the one filed with the state. This one bore different names in the spaces marked father and mother. Beneath it lay a newspaper clipping from 1974. Local couple dies in car accident. Infant son survives. The accompanying photograph showed a young man and woman, their faces bright with hope and love. Below their image, the caption read, "James and Helen Carson, survived by infant son Michael." Michael Carson. The name he'd carried for the first 2 years of his life, before the Mitchells adopted him and gave him a new identity, a new future. A better future they'd promised. The adoption had been arranged quietly, expensively, with documents sealed and records altered. The Mitchells had been unable to have children of their own, and Thomas had been raised as their biological son. He'd grown up believing the story completely until a deathbed confession from his adoptive mother revealed the truth. There had been other relatives, she'd whispered through morphine-hazed lips, grandparents who'd wanted him, fought for him. But they'd been poor, working-class people who couldn't provide the opportunities the Mitchells could offer. Money had changed hands. Legal maneuvers had been executed. The grandparents had been told the child had been placed with a family out of state and that contact was impossible. Thomas had burned every other copy of these documents he could find, had used his wealth and influence to ensure the truth stayed buried. The elderly couple who'd tried to claim him had eventually stopped searching, believing him lost forever to a system that favored money over blood. Now, staring at the photograph of his biological parents, Thomas felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crack. If those people in the church were who he feared they were, if they'd somehow found him after all these years. He slammed the folder shut and locked it away, but the damage was done. The faces from the photograph merged with the weathered features he'd glimpsed in the candlelight, aged by 50 years of grief and searching. His grandparents, James and Helen Carson's parents, still alive and somehow drawn to the very land their grandson now owned, trying to save the church where their son and daughter-in-law had been married. The irony was suffocating. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas reached the church, but the morning air still carried the scent of wet earth and decay. He'd barely slept after the encounter with the elderly couple, their faces haunting his thoughts like ghosts from a half-remembered nightmare. Now, standing before the crumbling stone structure in daylight, he could see clear evidence of their work. Fresh mortar lined several sections where loose stones had been carefully reset. The heavy wooden door, which had hung askew for years, now sat properly in its frame. Someone had even cleared the overgrown ivy from the stained glass windows, revealing fragments of colored light that danced across the interior walls. Thomas pushed open the door, its hinges silent now instead of shrieking their usual protest. Inside, the transformation was even more remarkable. Debris had been swept away, revealing worn but intact stone floors. The old wooden pews, which he'd assumed were rotted beyond repair, had been cleaned and reinforced with new brackets. Even the altar area had been restored to something approaching dignity. "You came back." The woman's voice came from the shadows near the pulpit. She emerged slowly, carrying a bundle of dried flowers that she began arranging in a tarnished brass vase. In the filtered morning light, her resemblance to someone he'd tried to forget was even more pronounced. "I want answers," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the small space, "starting with who you really are." The woman continued her work, her weathered hands moving with practiced care. "I told you yesterday. I'm Catherine Walsh. This is my husband, Patrick." The old man appeared from behind the altar, carrying a bucket of water. "Walsh." Thomas tested the name, searching his memory. "That name means nothing to me." Catherine looked up then, her blue eyes meeting his directly. "It wouldn't. We weren't always Walsh." Something cold settled in Thomas's stomach. "What were you before?" Patrick set down the bucket and moved to stand beside his wife, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "We were Murphy, Patrick and Catherine Murphy." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. He gripped the back of a pew to steady himself, memories flooding back with painful clarity. The Murphy family had worked his grandfather's land for 3 generations. Their daughter, Mary Murphy, had been Thomas's first love, his secret shame, and ultimately his greatest regret. "Mary's parents," he whispered. "Mary's parents," Catherine confirmed, her voice soft but steady. "Your son's grandparents." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 30 years of silence and separation. Thomas felt the careful walls he'd built around that part of his past beginning to crumble like the church stones the old couple had been so carefully replacing. "He doesn't know," Thomas said, though it came out more as a question than a statement. "About you?" Patrick's laugh held no humor. "How could he? You made sure of that." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering that terrible winter when everything had fallen apart. Mary, barely 18 and pregnant, standing in his father's study while the old man raged about reputation and propriety. The arranged marriage to Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of the neighboring estate, announced just weeks after Mary had been quietly sent away. The money that had changed hands, the papers that had been signed, the promises that had been broken. Where is he? The question escaped before Thomas could stop it. Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Safe," Loved. He has a good life, no thanks to you. Mary? A shadow passed over Catherine's face. Gone these 10 years. Cancer. The simple word gutted him. Thomas sank onto one of the restored pews, the weight of 3 decades of choices pressing down on his shoulders. She never told him? She told him his father was a good man who couldn't be part of his life, Patrick said, his tone carefully neutral. She made us promise to keep it that way. Then why are you here? Thomas looked up at them, these 2 people who had every reason to hate him. Why risk exposing everything now? Catherine resumed arranging the flowers, her movements deliberate and calm. We're old, Thomas. When we're gone, this place will be the only connection left between our family and yours, between your son and his heritage. He's not my son, Thomas said automatically, the denial that had protected him for 30 years. Blood doesn't lie, Catherine replied quietly, and neither does love, even when it's buried under years of regret and fear. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another storm. Through the newly cleaned windows, Thomas could see dark clouds gathering over his estate, over the life he'd built on foundations of silence and sacrifice. Everything he'd worked to protect, his marriage, his reputation, his carefully constructed world, suddenly felt as fragile as the ancient stones surrounding them. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Catherine placed the last flower in the vase and stepped back to admire her work. "Nothing you're not ready to give. But this church stays standing. It's all we have left of her." Thomas sat in his study until dawn, the whiskey untouched, his mind churning through decades of carefully constructed lies. The photograph lay face down on his desk where he'd dropped it hours earlier, but he could still see every detail burned into his memory. His father's arm around a woman who wasn't his mother, a woman whose weathered face he'd seen just yesterday, kneeling in the ruins of St. Catherine's. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the heavy curtains, Thomas finally moved. His joints protested as he stood, his body stiff from sitting motionless for so long. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Margaret Mitchell resided in the east wing of the estate, in rooms that had once belonged to Thomas's grandmother. At 83, his mother rarely left her suite, preferring the company of her books and memories to the complexities of the present. Thomas knocked gently before entering, finding her seated by the window with her morning tea. "You look terrible," she said without turning around. "Didn't sleep?" Thomas closed the door behind him and retrieved the photograph from his jacket pocket. "We need to talk." Margaret's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. When she finally turned to face him, Thomas saw recognition flicker in her pale blue eyes before she could mask it. "Where did you find that? Does it matter?" Thomas moved closer, studying his mother's face for any crack in her composure. "Mother, who is she?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Margaret's fingers worked at the pearl necklace at her throat, a nervous habit Thomas remembered from childhood. Finally she sighed. "Her name is Eleanor Hartwell. She was—" "Your father was—" Margaret's voice faltered. "Having an affair." Thomas finished the sentence his mother couldn't. "For how long?" 23 years. The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. His parents' marriage had lasted 31 years before his father's death. The affair had encompassed nearly 3/4 of their union. "Did you know?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Of course I knew. Do you think me such a fool? Your father thought he was being discreet, but Eleanor lived less than 5 miles away. People talk, Thomas, they always talk." Thomas sank into the chair across from her, his world tilting on its axis. "Why didn't you leave him?" "And go where? With what money?" Margaret's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. This was 1962, not today. Women didn't simply walk away from marriages, especially not women with children to protect. Your father made it clear that if I left, I would leave with nothing, no money, no home, and no you. The revelation cut deeper than Thomas had expected. His childhood suddenly looked different through this lens. His father's frequent absences, his mother's quiet resignation, the tension that had always hummed beneath the surface of their family dinners. The church, Thomas said slowly, pieces clicking into place. St. Catherine's, that's where they met. Margaret nodded. Eleanor was devoutly religious. She never missed a service. Your father started attending when you were about 6 years old, said it was important for the family to be seen as pillars of the community, but he was really going to see her. Among other things. Margaret's tone was sharp. They carried on right under everyone's noses, including mine. After services, he would linger, make conversation. Eventually, they began meeting there during the week. Empty churches make excellent hideaways for adulterous affairs. Thomas thought of the careful restoration work he'd witnessed, the reverent way Eleanor and her husband had touched the damaged walls. She still goes there. I imagine she would. Some people cling to their sacred spaces even after they've been desecrated. The cruelty in his mother's voice was startling. Thomas had always known her as gentle, if distant. This bitter woman before him was a stranger. Is that why you want it demolished? The church? Margaret's smile was cold. You want it demolished, Thomas. You've been fighting for those permits for 3 years, at your suggestion. I merely mentioned that the land would be valuable for development. You drew your own conclusions about the profitability. Thomas felt manipulated, a pawn in his mother's decades-old vendetta. What about her husband? Does he know? William Hartwell. Margaret spoke the name like a curse. He married her 6 months after your father died. Make of that what you will. The implications were staggering. Had Eleanor's husband known about the affair all along? Had he been waiting in the wings for Thomas's father to die? Or had Eleanor confessed everything after she was widowed, seeking absolution through honesty? There's more, isn't there? Thomas watched his mother's face carefully. Something you haven't told me. Margaret reached for her teacup with trembling hands. For the first time since he'd entered the room, she looked every one of her 83 years. Your father, she whispered, left her money in his will, a substantial amount. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mitchell estate as Thomas paced the length of his study, his coffee growing cold on the mahogany desk. Sleep had eluded him entirely after yesterday's encounter at the church. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, older, weathered by time and hardship, but unmistakably the woman who had once been his father's secretary. The woman who had disappeared without a trace 35 years ago, taking with her secrets that could unravel everything the Mitchell family had built. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, straightening his shoulders and attempting to compose himself. His assistant, Claire, peered around the door. "The contractors are here about the church demolition, Mr. Mitchell. Should I send them away?" Thomas hesitated. The demolition had been his priority for months. The land was perfect for the luxury housing development that would secure his financial future. But now, with Margaret and her husband taking refuge in the old building, everything had changed. "Tell them there's been a delay," he said finally. "Technical issues with the permits." Claire nodded and withdrew, leaving Thomas alone with his racing thoughts. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might provide them. 20 minutes later, Thomas found himself standing before the weathered headstone in Millbrook Cemetery. Eleanor Mitchell, the marble read, beloved wife and mother. His mother had been dead for 15 years, but the weight of her unspoken secrets felt heavier than ever. "I wish you were here to explain," he murmured to the silent stone. What really happened with Margaret? What did Father do that made her disappear? The cemetery offered no answers, only the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Thomas turned away, his jaw set with determination. If he couldn't get answers from the dead, he'd have to confront the living. The drive to his father's law firm took 30 minutes, long enough for Thomas to rehearse a dozen different conversations in his head. Harold Mitchell, now 82 and officially retired, still maintained an office in the building that bore his name. If anyone knew the truth about Margaret's disappearance, it would be him. The law offices of Mitchell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a restored Victorian building in the heart of downtown. Thomas nodded to the receptionist and headed straight for the elevator, his stomach churning with each passing floor. His father's office door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Thomas could see Harold hunched over legal documents, his white hair catching the afternoon light. He looked smaller than Thomas remembered, diminished by age and the weight of years. "Father," Thomas said, pushing the door open without knocking. Harold looked up, his pale blue eyes sharpening with surprise. "Thomas, this is unexpected. Shouldn't you be overseeing that church demolition?" "About that," Thomas said, settling into the leather chair across from his father's desk. "There's been a complication." Something flickered in Harold's expression, so brief Thomas almost missed it. "What sort of complication?" "Margaret Henley is back." The color drained from Harold's face. His hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble slightly as he set down his pen. The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of buried truth. "That's impossible," Harold said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret is dead." "Is she?" Thomas leaned forward, studying his father's face. "Because I spoke with her yesterday. She and her husband have been living in the old church fixing it up. She recognized me immediately." Harold's breathing became labored. He reached for a glass of water with shaking hands, spilling drops across the legal documents. "You must be mistaken. It's been 35 years. People change, She knew things, Father, about our family, about you." Thomas's voice grew harder. "What happened back then? Why did she really leave? I don't know what you're talking about." But Harold's protest sounded hollow, desperate. He couldn't meet Thomas's eyes. "She left right after the investigation into the Henderson land deal," Thomas pressed. "The one that made our family fortune, the one that somehow got cleared despite all those irregularities." Harold's face went ashen. "Thomas, please, some things are better left buried. Not when they're threatening to surface anyway." Thomas stood, planting his hands on the desk. "Margaret is back, and she's not hiding anymore. If there's something I need to know, something that could destroy us, I'd rather hear it from you than read about it in the newspapers." The old man seemed to collapse in on himself, suddenly looking every one of his 82 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Margaret wasn't just my secretary," he admitted. "She was the only witness to what really happened with the Henderson deal. And when she threatened to go to the authorities—" Harold's voice trailed off. "What did you do?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. His father's silence was answer enough. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "Your father made promises." What promises? And why had she looked at him with such knowing sadness, as if she could see straight through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his life? He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his father's old business partner, Harold Westbrook. If anyone knew about his father's dealings from 30 years ago, it would be Harold. The call went to voicemail. "Harold, it's Thomas Mitchell. I need to speak with you about some old business arrangements my father may have made regarding St. Mary's Church. Call me back as soon as possible." As he set the phone down, his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Mitchell, there's a young woman here to see you. Says it's about the church." Thomas frowned. "Did she give her name?" "Sarah Whitmore. She says she's a historian from the university." The name meant nothing to him, but something about the timing felt deliberate. "Show her in." Sarah Whitmore was perhaps 30, with earnest brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a messenger bag slung across her shoulder. She carried herself with the determined air of someone on a mission. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me. I know this is unexpected, but I've been researching the history of St. Mary's Church for my dissertation, and I've uncovered some documents that I think you should see." Thomas gestured to the leather chairs by the fireplace. "What kind of documents?" She pulled out a manila folder, her movements careful and precise. "I've been working in the county archives, and I found correspondence between your father and the church vestry from 1993. There was an agreement, a covenant actually, regarding the church's preservation." The whiskey turned to acid in Thomas's stomach. "What kind of covenant?" Sarah spread several photocopied pages on the coffee table. "Your father provided significant funding for the church's restoration in exchange for a promise that it would remain a place of worship in perpetuity. But there's more. She pulled out another document. This is a deed transfer from the same year. Your father purchased additional land adjacent to your property, but the sale was contingent on maintaining the church. Thomas leaned forward, scanning the papers. His father's signature was unmistakable at the bottom of each page. This doesn't make sense. My father wasn't religious. Why would he care about preserving a church? That's what I was hoping you could tell me, Sarah said. But there's something else. The funding came with specific stipulations about who would oversee the church's care. 2 individuals were named as permanent caretakers, with housing provided in the old rectory. Who? Sarah pointed to a line of text. Margaret and Robert Hartwell. The room seemed to tilt. Thomas set down his glass with a trembling hand. Hartwell? You recognize the name? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Harold Westbrook. Thomas looked at Sarah. Excuse me, I need to take this. Thomas, my boy, Harold's gravelly voice filled the speaker. Got your message about St. Mary's? Hell of a thing, that situation. What situation, Harold? What did my father promise? A long pause. I was wondering when this would come up. Your father made me swear never to tell you, but I suppose with him gone... Another pause. The Hartwells were the rightful owners of that church property, Thomas. Had been for generations. Your grandfather bought it from them during the Depression when they were desperate. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath him. What are you saying? Your father felt guilty about it his whole life. When Robert Hartwell came back to town in the early 90s, he'd been away for decades. Your father tried to make it right. Gave them back the church and the rectory officially, but he asked them to keep it quiet. Why? Because your grandfather's business practices weren't always ethical. If word got out about the Hartwell situation, it might have led to questions about other acquisitions. Your father was protecting the family reputation, but he was also trying to do the right thing. Thomas closed his eyes. So the church belongs to the Hartwells. Always has, technically. Your father just returned what should never have been taken. Harold's voice softened. There's something else, son. The reason your father cared so much about making this right. Margaret Hartwell isn't just any old woman. She's your grandmother's sister, your great-aunt. The phone slipped from Thomas's hand, clattering onto the table. Sarah was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly having heard Harold's words. Family. The old woman in the church was family, and he'd been trying to destroy her home for years. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas reached his car, but the dampness seemed to have settled into his bones. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, Margaret's words echoing in his mind like a death knell. Your father knew exactly who we were. He drove aimlessly through the countryside, past fields he'd known since childhood, past tenant farms that had been in families for generations. Everything looked different now, as if someone had shifted the lens through which he viewed his entire life. The neat boundaries of his world, the clear lines between right and wrong, between his family's honor and others' shame, had blurred beyond recognition. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the manor house loomed against the grey sky, like a monument to everything he thought he'd known about himself. The Mitchell coat of arms carved above the entrance seemed to mock him now. Honor above all. What a joke. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway, and he remembered she'd mentioned visiting her sister in town. For once, he was grateful for her absence. He needed time to think, to process what he'd learned before facing her questions about where he'd been. Inside, the house felt cavernous and cold. Thomas poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from his father's crystal decanter, the same one that had sat on this desk for 40 years, and sank into the leather chair behind his mahogany desk. The chair where his father had conducted business, where he'd made decisions that affected dozens of families, where he'd apparently orchestrated a cover-up that had destroyed innocent lives. Thomas opened the bottom drawer of the desk, something he rarely did. Inside lay his father's papers, documents he'd inherited but never thoroughly examined. Business contracts, property deeds, correspondence with lawyers and local officials. He'd always assumed it was routine paperwork from a simpler time. Now he wasn't so sure. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Church Property, 1983, and spread its contents across the desk. What he found made his stomach turn. There were letters to the police chief recommending they handle the matter quietly for the good of all involved. There were payments to witnesses, documented as consulting fees, but clearly labeled in his father's handwriting as silence money. Most damning of all, there was a letter from Margaret's husband, David, written from prison. To Mr. Mitchell, the letter began in a shaky hand. I know you don't believe me, but I swear on my daughter's grave that I never touched that girl. Someone else was in the church that night, someone with more to lose than a poor groundskeeper. I'm begging you to look at the evidence again. My wife has nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Please. Attached to the letter was his father's response, typed on Mitchell family letterhead. And Mr. Whitmore, you were found guilty by a jury of your peers. I suggest you accept responsibility for your actions and serve your time quietly. Any further contact with my family will result in a harassment complaint to the prison authorities. Thomas read both letters twice, his hands shaking. The date on David's letter was 6 months before his death in prison. 6 months of a desperate man pleading for justice while Thomas's father stonewalled him. But it was the final document in the folder that made Thomas's blood run cold. A police report, never filed, written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd clearly struggled over every word. It described finding evidence at the scene, evidence that pointed to someone other than David Whitmore, evidence that had apparently been buried along with the truth. The report was signed by Officer Michael Carson, a name Thomas remembered from his childhood. Carson had been young then, new to the force, and had always seemed nervous around Thomas's father. Now Thomas understood why. "Thomas?" Sarah's voice called from the front hall. "Are you home?" In the study he managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. She appeared in the doorway moments later, her cheeks flushed from the cool air, looking so normal and unchanged that it seemed impossible his entire world had shifted in the span of a few hours. "How was your day?" she asked, then stopped, studying his face. "You look terrible. Are you feeling all right?" Thomas forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "Just tired. Long day." Sarah moved closer, her expression concerned. "You've been acting strange lately, distracted. Is there something going on with the business? Problems I should know about?" He almost laughed at the innocence of her question. "Business problems. If only it were that simple." "Nothing like that," he said, standing and moving to the window. Outside, the church spire was barely visible through the trees, a constant reminder of secrets that refused to stay buried. "The church demolition is moving forward, isn't it?" Sarah asked. "I know how important that project is to you." Thomas closed his eyes. Important. Yes, it had been important, critically important, for reasons he was only now beginning to understand. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Thomas sat in his study, Eleanor's words echoing in his mind like a funeral bell. "Well, Father knew about us." The whiskey glass trembled in his hand as he stared at the photograph on his desk, him and his father at the groundbreaking ceremony for Mitchell Industries' first major development, both smiling triumphantly at the camera. How many lies had been built into that smile? Thomas pulled open the bottom drawer of his father's old desk, the one he never bothered to clean out properly after the funeral 5 years ago. His fingers moved past outdated contracts and yellowed newspaper clippings until they found what he was looking for, a small leather journal bound with a rubber band that had lost its elasticity years ago. He'd discovered it shortly after his father's death, but had never found the courage to read it. Now, as he opened to the first page, he understood why some secrets were meant to stay buried. Spate March 15th, 1987. "Eleanor came to see me today. She's pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. Thomas calculated quickly. 1987, he would have been 7 years old, playing in the very halls of this house while his father was... "She won't tell me who the father is, but I can see it in her eyes. She's protecting someone." Always protecting someone, my Eleanor. I've arranged for her and James to leave town. It's better this way. Thomas must never know. The journal slipped from Thomas's fingers, pages fluttering as it hit the Persian rug. He understood now why Eleanor had looked at him with such sadness, such recognition. She hadn't just known his father, she'd been his father's secret, and someone else's. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Through the study window, he watched as Catherine's sedan pulled up to the house, her headlights cutting through the darkness before going dark. She emerged from the car, her usually perfect composure replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Thomas met her at the front door before she could knock. Catherine stood on his doorstep, still in her evening dress from some charity function, her carefully styled hair now wind-blown and her makeup smudged. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, pushing past him into the foyer. "Catherine, it's midnight." "I know what time it is." She spun to face him, her green eyes blazing. "I know about the church, Thomas. I know about the old couple you found there." Something cold settled in Thomas's stomach. "How could you possibly—" "Because I hired someone to watch them." Catherine's confession came out in a rush. "I've known they were there for weeks. I was waiting for the right moment to use it against you." The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. "Against me? Catherine, what the hell are you talking about?" She moved past him into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. "The Mitchell name means something in this town, Thomas. It means respectability, legacy, power. But if people found out you'd been harboring vagrants in that church, that you'd gone soft—" "Soft?" Thomas followed her, anger building in his chest. "Is that what you call basic human decency?" Catherine whirled around, her face flushed. "I call it weakness, the same weakness that's been holding you back from greatness. But it doesn't matter now." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "I was going to use these photographs to convince you to finally tear down that eyesore, but then I discovered something far more interesting." Thomas stared at the envelope as if it contained venomous snakes. "What did you do?" "I had my investigator look into your squatter's background, James and Eleanor Whitmore." Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "Imagine my surprise when I learned that Eleanor Whitmore gave birth to a daughter in 1987, a daughter who was quietly adopted by the Morrison family and renamed Catherine." The world tilted sideways. Thomas gripped the back of the sofa to steady himself as Catherine's words sank in. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that the old woman in your precious church is my biological mother." Catherine's voice was eerily calm now, the storm having passed into something far more dangerous. "And according to the birth certificate, the father is listed as unknown. But we both know that's not true, don't we, Thomas?" The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. The familiar green eyes he'd noticed in Eleanor, Catherine's inexplicable obsession with the Mitchell family's social standing, the way she'd pursued him with such calculated determination. "You've known," he whispered. "This whole time, you've known." Catherine nodded slowly. "I've suspected for years. Why do you think I worked so hard to become indispensable to you? To your family's legacy?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because there's a very good chance, dear Thomas, that your father was mine too." The rain hammered against the windows of Thomas's study as he stared at the faded photograph in his trembling hands. Margaret sat across from him, her weathered face etched with decades of pain, while Robert stood behind her chair like a protective sentinel. The resemblance was undeniable now that Thomas knew what to look for. The same stubborn jawline, the same deep-set eyes that had haunted his childhood memories. "You were supposed to be dead," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Father told me you died in the fire, both of you." Margaret's laugh was bitter, devoid of any warmth. "Your father told you many things, didn't he? Always so good with stories, that one." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "Did he tell you why we left? Did he explain what really happened that night?" Thomas set the photograph down with careful precision, his businessman's composure cracking like ice in spring. There was an accident. The mill caught fire. You and Uncle Robert were killed trying to save the workers. The words felt hollow as he spoke them, rehearsed lines from a play he'd never auditioned for. An accident, Robert repeated, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. His voice carried the weight of decades spent in manual labor, roughened by years of silence. Is that what we're calling it now? The storm outside seemed to intensify, lightning illuminating the study in stark flashes that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Thomas found himself remembering fragments, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, the way servants would glance at him with something that might have been pity, his father's increasingly erratic behavior in the months following the fire. "Tell me what really happened," Thomas said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Margaret reached into her worn coat and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with string. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. "Your father was drowning in debt, Thomas. The mill, the land, this house, all of it mortgaged to the hilt. He'd been gambling, making investments that went bad." She untied the string with practiced movements. The insurance on the mill was substantial, enough to save everything. Thomas felt the room tilt slightly, as if the foundation itself had shifted. "You're saying he burned it down deliberately?" "We're saying we saw him do it," Robert said quietly. "We were working late that night, trying to finish an order. Margaret and I, we'd been meeting in secret. Your father, he'd made it clear that mill workers and family didn't mix." Margaret's fingers traced the edges of the letters. "We heard someone moving around downstairs, thought it might be thieves. When we looked, we saw Jonathan pouring kerosene near the machinery." Her voice grew distant, lost in memory. "He saw us watching. For a moment I thought he might stop, might come to his senses. But he didn't," Thomas said, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "He set the fire anyway," Robert confirmed. "Then he came after us, said we'd seen too much, that we'd ruin everything." Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination Thomas could see old scars along Robert's hairline, partially hidden by his grey hair. Margaret opened the first letter, her hands steady despite their age. "We barely escaped. Jonathan, your father." He tried to stop us. There was a fight. She glanced at Robert, some silent communication passing between them. "We thought he was dead when we left him there." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture Thomas had never wanted to see. "So you ran." "We had no choice," Margaret said. "When we heard that we were being blamed for the fire, listed among the dead, we realized what he'd done. He'd found a way to collect the insurance and eliminate the witnesses at the same time." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked down the glass like tears. "Why the church? Why come back now, after all these years?" "Because it's where we were married," Robert said simply. "The night before the fire. Father McKenna performed the ceremony in secret. It was the last pure thing that happened before everything went to hell." Margaret rose and joined Thomas at the window, her reflection ghostly in the storm-darkened glass. "We've spent 40 years living under assumed names, never staying anywhere too long. But we're old now, Thomas, tired. We wanted to restore one good memory before we die." Thomas watched his aunt's reflection, seeing his father's features rearranged by time and hardship. "The land deals," he said suddenly. "The development contracts. If this comes out, everything you've built on the foundation of that insurance money will crumble." Margaret finished. "Yes, we know." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside the study, Thomas felt as though a much larger tempest was just beginning. Thomas's hands trembled as he stared at the faded photograph Margaret had placed before him. The sepia-toned image showed a young woman in a simple white dress standing beside a man in military uniform, both beaming at the camera. Behind them, the church stood in its former glory, its stained glass windows catching the light like jewels. "That's my grandmother," Margaret said softly, her weathered finger tracing the woman's face. "Elena Vasquez. She was married in that church in 1943. just before my grandfather shipped out to France. The room seemed to spin around Thomas Elena Vasquez, the name from the property records that had haunted him for weeks. The mysterious woman who had supposedly owned the land before his family acquired it in 1944. "You're lying," he whispered, though even as the words left his lips, he could see the resemblance. Margaret had the same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure as the woman in the photograph. Harold leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave. "Your grandfather never told you the truth, did he, about how he really acquired that land?" Thomas felt the foundations of everything he believed shifting beneath him. "My grandfather bought it fair and square. The previous owner defaulted on taxes during the war. It was a legal transaction." "Legal, perhaps," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but not honorable. Elena was pregnant when my grandfather left for the war. She was trying to hold on to their home, their land, everything they'd built together. But she was alone, struggling, and the taxes kept climbing." The elderly woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Your grandfather knew she was desperate. He offered her money, but not nearly what the land was worth. When she refused, he found other ways to pressure her. He had connections, influence. Suddenly, her tax burden increased. The bank called in loans that shouldn't have been due for years." Thomas's chest tightened. That's not possible. My grandfather was an honorable man. He built our family's reputation on integrity." Harold's laugh was bitter. "Integrity? He forced a pregnant woman from her home while her husband was fighting overseas. Elena lost everything. The land, the church where she was married, the house where she planned to raise her child. She died in childbirth 6 months later, alone in a tenement in the city." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He thought of all the stories his grandfather had told him about building the Mitchell legacy through hard work and fair dealing. Every family dinner where they'd toasted their ancestors' noble character. Every business deal where Thomas had prided himself on upholding the Mitchell reputation. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Margaret rose slowly and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner. She returned with a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. "These are her letters to my grandfather overseas. She wrote about your grandfather's visits, his threats, the mounting pressure. And this," she pulled out an official document, "this is the eviction notice." Thomas's hands shook as he read the papers. The letterhead bore his grandfather's name. The language was cold, legal, final. Elena's handwriting in the margins showed her desperation. "Please, Mr. Mitchell, just a little more time. The baby is coming soon." "My father spent his whole life looking for justice," Harold continued. "He was born after Elena died, raised by her sister. When he learned the truth about what happened to his mother, he vowed to reclaim what was stolen. But your family was too powerful, too established. So he did what he could. He married my mother and took her name, but he never forgot." "Neither did I." Thomas looked up from the papers, his vision blurring. "The church. That's why you've been restoring it." "It's the only piece of her left," Margaret whispered. "The only place where she was truly happy. We couldn't save her land, couldn't undo what your grandfather did, but we could honor her memory. We could keep alive the place where she promised to love my grandfather forever." The weight of the revelation crushed down on Thomas. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was founded on a lie. Worse than a lie, it was built on another family's tragedy. "The development project," he said hoarsely. "I was going to tear it all down." "We know," Harold said. "We've been watching, waiting, hoping that somehow you'd see what that place really means. Not just to us, but to the truth." Thomas stood abruptly, the papers falling from his lap. He needed air, space, time to process what he'd learned. At the door, he turned back to face the elderly couple who had just shattered his world. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Margaret's eyes met his, and in them he saw not anger or vengeance, but something far more devastating: hope. "We want you to help us finish what we started," she said simply. "We want you to help us save Elena's church." The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fragments of color across the church floor where Thomas knelt beside his father. Henry's breathing had grown shallow during the night, each exhale a whisper that seemed to carry decades of unspoken words. "I should have told you sooner," Henry murmured, his weathered hand gripping Thomas's with surprising strength. "About everything. About why I really left." Margaret sat in the front pew, her own eyes red from sleepless vigil. She had barely spoken since their confrontation the previous evening, but her presence felt like an anchor in the storm of revelations that had torn through Thomas's carefully constructed world. "The mill," Henry continued, his voice gaining clarity as if confession itself were medicine. "It wasn't just poor management that nearly killed it. I was being blackmailed." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Blackmailed? By whom? Jonathan Carver. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Carver Industries, the corporate giant that had been circling his properties for months, making increasingly aggressive offers. The same company whose representatives had seemed to know intimate details about the Mitchell family's financial vulnerabilities. He knew, Henry whispered, about Elizabeth, about what really happened the night she died. Margaret's sharp intake of breath echoed through the church. Thomas turned to see his mother's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as they clutched her shawl. "Mother?" Thomas's voice cracked. "What is he talking about?" Margaret rose slowly, moving toward them with the careful steps of someone walking toward an executioner's block. "Your father isn't telling you everything," she said softly. "He's protecting me, still protecting me after all these years." The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Thomas looked between his parents, the father who had abandoned him, the mother who had raised him on carefully constructed lies, both now stripped of the masks they had worn for decades. "Elizabeth didn't die in an accident," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She was murdered, and I saw who did it." The church seemed to spin around Thomas. He gripped the pew for support, his mind racing to process this new horror. "You saw who? Who killed her?" "Jonathan Carver's son, David." He was drunk, angry that Elizabeth had refused his advances earlier that evening. He found her walking home from the church social and... Margaret's voice broke. "He pushed her into the quarry pond, and then he just left her there." Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside him, like tectonic plates realigning. The sister he had mourned, whose tragic accident had shaped his entire childhood, had been murdered, and his mother had witnessed it. "Why didn't you go to the police?" he demanded. "I tried," Margaret said, "but the Carvers owned half the county back then. When I went to Sheriff Williams, he told me to keep quiet unless I wanted my family to suffer the same fate. Said it would be my word against David Carver's, and we both knew which one the courts would believe." Henry struggled to sit up straighter. "When Jonathan Carver approached me years later, I thought it was about a business loan. Instead, he told me he knew what his son had done and that he knew Margaret had seen it. He offered me a choice: leave town quietly and never speak of it, or watch our family destroyed piece by piece." The implications crashed over Thomas like waves. "So you left. You let everyone think you were a failure, a coward. To protect you and your mother, yes." Henry's eyes blazed with the intensity Thomas remembered from childhood. "Carver promised that if I disappeared, he would leave you both alone. But if I stayed, if Margaret ever spoke about what she saw, he would make sure our family lost everything." Thomas understood now why the church had become so important to his parents in their exile. It wasn't just about faith or community, it was about preserving the place where Elizabeth had spent her last happy evening, the final location where their family had been whole. "David Carver died 5 years ago," Margaret said quietly. "Cancer. But Jonathan is still alive, still pulling strings. When you started receiving those buyout offers, I knew he was making his final move." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The pressure to sell the properties, the mysterious knowledge of family debts, the timing of everything, it was all orchestrated. Jonathan Carver was finishing what he had started decades ago, erasing the Mitchell family from the landscape entirely. But something else became clear too. His parents' return to the church wasn't just about memory or redemption. They were taking a stand, finally refusing to run or hide. Every board they repaired, every window they cleaned, was an act of defiance against the man who had destroyed their lives. Thomas looked at his father's determined face, at his mother's tear-stained but resolute expression, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Despite everything, despite the lies and abandonment and secrets, they were still a family. Broken, perhaps, but not defeated. Not yet. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas stared at the faded photograph in Eleanor's weathered hands, his world tilting on its axis. The young woman in the wedding dress bore his mother's smile, his own stubborn chin, but the man beside her wasn't his father. "Catherine was barely 18 when she married my brother Samuel," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were so happy, planning to restore this church together, to build a life in Millbrook. Then the accident happened." Thomas's legs gave out, and he sank onto a dusty pew. "What accident?" Harold cleared his throat, his eyes cloudy with decades-old grief. "The mill explosion. Samuel was helping the owner repair some machinery when the boiler burst. 3 men died that day, including my brother. But my mother married my father, James Mitchell. They built the estate together." The words felt hollow even as Thomas spoke them. Eleanor shook her head gently. "Catherine was pregnant when Samuel died. James Mitchell was a good man, lonely after losing his first wife. He offered marriage, legitimacy for the child, a future. Catherine was drowning in grief and had no family to turn to. It seemed like salvation. The pieces of his life rearranged themselves with sickening clarity. His mother's melancholy, the way she sometimes stared out the library windows toward the church. His father's emotional distance, the sense that Thomas was somehow never quite enough. The family portraits that never quite looked right. "You're saying James Mitchell wasn't my biological father?" "James raised you as his own," Harold said firmly. "He was a good father to you, Thomas. But yes, Samuel was your blood father, my brother." The irony struck him like a physical blow. For years, he'd been trying to demolish the very church his real father had loved, the place where his parents had pledged their lives to each other, the place his biological uncle and aunt had been secretly restoring. "Why didn't my mother tell me?" His voice cracked like an adolescent's. "Shame, perhaps, or protection," Eleanor said. "The Aldridges were poor, working people. James Mitchell was offering security, status. Catherine thought she was giving you the best life possible. But you knew, you both knew, and you came back here anyway." Harold nodded. "We left Millbrook after Samuel died. Too many memories, too much pain. But when we heard about the demolition plans, we couldn't let it happen. This church holds the only happy memories we have of Samuel, the only proof he existed." Thomas thought of Sarah, of their conversation about truth and deception. He'd accused the old couple of lying while building his entire life on a foundation of secrets. The wealth he'd inherited, the respect the Mitchell name commanded, the very identity he'd constructed, all of it rested on a fiction. "Does anyone else know?" "We never told a soul," Eleanor said. "Your mother swore us to secrecy before we left town. She said it would only hurt you and James to know the truth." But it did hurt. It hurt with a bone-deep ache that made Thomas question everything. Every business decision he'd made in his father's memory, every tradition he'd upheld, every assumption about his place in the world, all of it suddenly felt fraudulent. He stood abruptly, pacing to the altar where Samuel and Catherine had exchanged vows. His parents, not the stern, proper couple in the oil paintings at home, but young lovers planning a simple life of faith and community service. "The development," he said suddenly. "If this gets out, is that what you're worried about?" Harold's voice carried a sharp edge. "Your precious reputation." Thomas spun around, anger flaring. "You don't understand. The investors, the contracts, my entire business is built on the Mitchell legacy. If people learn that I'm not really what? A Mitchell?" Eleanor stood, her frail frame somehow commanding. You are exactly who you've always been, Thomas. The only difference is now you know where half your stubbornness comes from." She was right, and he hated her for it. Nothing had actually changed except his understanding of his own history. But somehow that felt like everything. "The church," he said finally. "The demolition is scheduled for next week." "We know." Harold's shoulders sagged in defeat. "We'd hoped to finish the basic repairs, to document what we could before—" "We're old, Thomas. We don't have much fight left." Thomas looked around the sanctuary with new eyes. This wasn't just another obstacle to his vision of progress. This was where his story began, where his real parents had promised to love each other forever, where Samuel Aldridge had dreamed of serving his community before fate cut those dreams short. The weight of decision pressed down on him like the crushing depth of the ocean. 3 generations of secrets had led to this moment, to this choice between honoring the truth and protecting the lie that had shaped his entire existence. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas reached the old cemetery behind the church, but the ground squelched beneath his feet as he made his way through the weathered headstones. Margaret and Henry were already there, standing before a modest granite marker that Thomas had somehow never noticed in all his years of avoiding this place. "We come here every year," Margaret said softly, not turning around when she heard his footsteps. "On the anniversary." Thomas approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The inscription on the headstone was simple: Eleanor Rose Mitchell, beloved daughter, 1985 to 2005 ascent. Below it, fresh wildflowers lay scattered across the wet grass, the same pale yellow blooms that grew wild in the meadows surrounding his estate. "She loved those flowers," Henry said, his voice thick with memory. "Used to pick them every spring and bring them to us in great armfuls. Said they looked like captured sunshine." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. 20 years. For 20 years he had convinced himself that Eleanor's death had been an accident, a tragic collision on a rain-slicked road that had nothing to do with the bitter argument they'd had that night. The argument about the church, about his plans to demolish it and sell the land to developers. The argument that had sent her storming out into the night, tears streaming down her face as she accused him of caring more about money than about the community their family had served for generations. "She was coming to see you that night," Margaret continued, her fingers tracing the carved letters of their granddaughter's name. "After she left Thomas's house, she stopped by ours first. She was so upset, but so determined. She said she was going to find a way to save the church, with or without his help." "Where was she going?" Thomas whispered, though he dreaded the answer. "To the county courthouse," Henry replied. "She'd discovered some old papers in your father's study, documents that proved the church couldn't legally be demolished because of its historical designation. She wanted to file them first thing in the morning, but she was afraid you might destroy them if you found out she had them." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor had hidden the papers somewhere, planning to retrieve them after the storm passed. She'd been driving back from town when the accident happened, probably rushing through the rain to keep them safe from his reach, and he had spent the last 20 years believing she had died simply because she was young and reckless and couldn't control her emotions. "The historical designation," Thomas said numbly. "Is that why you've been repairing the church?" Margaret finally turned to face him, and he saw that her eyes were red with unshed tears. "She died trying to protect this place. The least we could do was honor that sacrifice. But the papers were destroyed in the accident," Henry finished. "We tried to recreate them from memory, but we never had your father's connections or resources. All we could do was maintain the building and hope that someday what?" Margaret's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Someday you would remember why this place mattered to her, why it should matter to you." Thomas stared at the headstone, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Eleanor, at 8 years old, insisting on attending every Sunday service, even when he wanted to sleep in. Eleanor, at 16, volunteering to help organize the church's annual charity drive. Eleanor, at 20, arguing passionately that some things were more valuable than money, that their family had a responsibility to preserve what previous generations had built. "I killed her," he said, the words barely audible. No. Margaret's voice was firm. Grief killed her. The same grief that's been killing you all these years, Thomas. The grief of a family that forgot how to talk to each other. If I hadn't been so stubborn about the demolition, if we hadn't been so proud, Henry interrupted, if we'd swallowed our anger and come to you after the funeral instead of nursing our resentment for 20 years, if Eleanor had waited until morning instead of driving in the storm. There are 1,000 ifs, Thomas, but only one truth that matters now. Thomas looked up from the grave to meet Henry's eyes. What truth? That Eleanor believed this church was worth saving, and she believed you were worth saving too, or she wouldn't have fought so hard to change your mind. The wind picked up, scattering the yellow petals across the wet ground. Thomas watched them blow away and felt something shift inside his chest, not the sharp crack of breaking, but the slow, careful movement of healing. For the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to remember not just Eleanor's death, but her life, her laughter, her stubborn determination to see the best in everyone, even him. "What do you need?" he asked quietly. Margaret and Henry exchanged a glance, hope flickering cautiously in their weathered faces. "Help," Margaret said simply. "The foundation is worse than we can manage alone." Thomas nodded, still looking at Eleanor's name carved in stone. "Then let's fix it." The rain had started again, drumming against the windows of Thomas's study as he sat surrounded by the scattered remnants of his family's history. Birth certificates, property deeds, yellowed photographs, and his grandfather's journals lay spread across the mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle he'd been afraid to assemble for 30 years. His hands trembled as he opened the leather-bound journal to the entry dated September 15th, 1952. His grandfather's precise handwriting seemed to blur as he read the words that confirmed his worst fears. The fire was meant to be contained to the east wing, but the wind carried it further than anticipated. Margaret and William barely escaped with their lives, though the townspeople believed them dead. "I have arranged for their passage to Scotland under new names. The insurance money will cover Thomas's medical expenses and secure our family's future. But the weight of what I've done grows heavier each day. May God forgive me for choosing my grandson's life over the truth." Thomas closed his eyes, the journal falling from his numb fingers. The medical expenses his grandfather had written about, those were for the surgery that had saved Thomas's life when he was 7 years old, the operation that had cost more than their family could afford. His grandfather had staged the fire, had let everyone believe the Ashford servants had perished, all to claim the insurance money that would pay for Thomas's treatment. A knock at the study door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah entered, her expression grave. She'd been helping him sort through the documents for the past 3 hours, and the revelation had shaken her as much as it had him. "I've found something else," she said quietly, placing a manila folder on the desk. "These were in your grandfather's safe deposit box." Inside the folder were bank statements showing regular transfers to a Scottish account payments that had continued for decades after the fire. Even after his grandfather's death, the family's lawyers had continued the payments on Thomas's behalf, though they'd been told it was for a distant relative's care. "They never took a penny more than they needed," Sarah observed, scanning the modest amounts. "Just enough to live quietly, to stay hidden." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the church grounds. Through the rain, he could see lights flickering in the old building where Margaret and William, the Ashfords, were likely taking shelter. They'd returned to claim what was rightfully theirs, only to find their former home turned into a monument to the lie that had funded his family's prosperity. "Everything I've built," he said, his breath fogging the glass, the land acquisitions, the business empire, even this house. It all started with that blood money. Sarah moved beside him, her presence a comfort he didn't deserve. "You were a child, Thomas. You didn't know. But I know now." He turned to face her, seeing his own anguish reflected in her eyes. "Every day I've fought to tear down that church. I was trying to erase the evidence of my family's guilt. And they..." He gestured toward the church. They came back to repair it, to restore what we destroyed. The implications crashed over him like a tide. The development project that would make him millions, the Historic Preservation Society's opposition, the town council meetings where he'd argued passionately for demolition, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies and stolen lives. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I make amends for something that happened 70 years ago? How do I give them back the life my family stole?" Sarah took his hand, her touch grounding him. "You start by talking to them. You listen to their story, and you figure out what justice looks like now." Thunder rumbled overhead as Thomas considered her words. The Ashfords had every right to expose the truth, to destroy his reputation and reclaim their property. They could have done so the moment they'd returned to town, but instead they'd chosen to work quietly, secretly restoring the church that had once been the heart of their community. "There's something else," Sarah said hesitantly. "I called the town clerk's office about the original property records, the church and the surrounding land. It was part of the Ashford estate before the fire. If they can prove their identity, they could take everything," Thomas finished. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years trying to demolish the church, and now he might lose not just the building but the entire foundation of his wealth. But as he stared out at the flickering lights in the old stone building, Thomas felt something unexpected wash over him: relief. The weight he'd carried without understanding, the restless guilt that had driven his need to erase the church from existence, finally had a name and a face. Tomorrow, he would walk across that rain-soaked ground and face the ghosts his family had created. Tonight, he would plan how to begin making amends for a debt that could never truly be repaid. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of the church, casting fractured rainbows across the worn wooden pews. Thomas sat in the front row, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The silence felt heavier than any storm, broken only by the distant sound of Margaret sweeping debris from the altar. He had spent the entire night walking the grounds of his estate, circling back again and again to the same impossible truth. The woman who had been secretly restoring this church, the woman he had threatened and tried to drive away, was his own mother. The mother who had supposedly died when he was 7 years old. "You're angry!" Margaret's voice drifted from behind him, gentle but resigned. Thomas didn't turn around. "Angry doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling right now." Her footsteps approached slowly, deliberately. She settled into the pew beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. Up close, he could see the years etched into her face, the silver threading through hair that had once been the same dark brown as his own. "I know you have questions." "Questions?" Thomas finally looked at her, his voice rising in the empty church. "My mother has been dead for 30 years. I mourned you. I spent my entire childhood believing I was responsible for your death because I got sick and you caught my fever. Do you have any idea what that does to a 7-year-old boy?" Margaret's composure cracked, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "Thomas, I never wanted you to think—" "But I did think it. For decades." He stood abruptly, pacing to the altar where Edward continued his quiet repairs, pointedly not looking in their direction. "Father told me you died calling my name, that you were delirious with fever, asking for me. He said your last words were about how much you loved me." Charles always was a talented storyteller. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Thomas whirled around. "Don't you dare speak about him like that. He raised me alone. He was everything to me after he told me you were gone. He was also the man who had me committed to an asylum because I dared to question his business practices." Margaret's voice was steady now, but Thomas could see her hands trembling. "Because I threatened to expose what he was doing to the tenant families." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He sank back onto the pew, his mind reeling. "That's impossible. Father was respected, Honorable. Your father was many things, but honorable wasn't one of them. Edward spoke for the first time that morning, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "I worked his land for 15 years, Thomas. I saw what happened to families who couldn't make their payments. I saw children turned out in winter storms. I saw good men broken by his greed." Thomas shook his head violently. "No, you're lying, both of you. This is some elaborate scheme." "The Whitmore family," Margaret said quietly. "Little Sarah Whitmore was only 3 when your father evicted them in the dead of winter. She died of pneumonia 2 weeks later. Your father foreclosed on Christmas Eve." The name hit Thomas like ice water. He knew the Whitmore plot in the cemetery. He had seen the tiny headstone with its heartbreaking epitaph, but he had never known the story behind it. "I begged him to wait until spring," Margaret continued. "I offered to pay their debt myself. When he refused, I told him I would go to the authorities, to the newspapers, that I wouldn't let him destroy another family." Her voice broke. "The next morning, 2 men came to the house. Charles told you I was ill, that I needed special care. By evening, I was locked away in Millbrook Asylum." Thomas felt the foundations of his world crumbling beneath him. Everything he had built, everything he believed about his family, about himself, was constructed on lies. "The asylum records," he whispered. "I could check." "Burned in a convenient fire 3 years after I escaped," Edward said grimly. Amazing how often that happened when Charles Mitchell was involved. "Escaped?" Margaret reached toward him tentatively, then pulled her hand back when he flinched away. "It took me 8 years to convince them I wasn't the hysteric Charles had painted me to be. 8 years of being told my son was better off without me, that I was an unfit mother. When I finally got out, you were 15 years old and believed I was dead. Charles had remarried. You had a new family. So you stayed away. It wasn't a question. I tried to approach you once. You were 17, walking near the old mill. You looked so much like your father, so sure of yourself, so proud of the Mitchell name. I realized that coming back would only destroy the life you had built on the foundation of my supposed death." Thomas buried his face in his hands. "Why now? Why reveal yourselves now?" "Because," Margaret said softly, "this church was the only place your father ever showed mercy. It was where we were married, where you were baptized. I couldn't let you destroy it without knowing the truth about what you were really destroying." The rain had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and sharp in the aftermath of the storm. Thomas stood at the kitchen window of the manor house, watching water drip from the eaves like tears he couldn't shed. Behind him, Eleanor moved quietly, preparing tea with the practiced grace that had once charmed dinner parties and board meetings alike. Now her movements carried the weight of 30 years' worth of buried truths. "They're waiting," she said softly, setting the china cups on the tray with careful precision. Margaret called, "They're at the church." Thomas didn't turn around. The grounds stretched before him, immaculate and controlled, every hedge trimmed to perfection, every path swept clean. How easily order could mask chaos, how readily beauty could hide rot. "Thomas." Eleanor's voice held a note he hadn't heard in decades, vulnerability wrapped in determination. "We have to tell her. Sarah, their daughter, their pride, their carefully constructed lie. She was driving up from London now, summoned by Eleanor's cryptic phone call about a family emergency. She would arrive within the hour, expecting explanations about the church, about the mysterious couple, about why her father had suddenly abandoned his demolition plans. She would not expect to learn that her entire identity was built on a foundation of deceit. Thomas finally turned, studying his wife's face. Eleanor had aged well, her silver hair still elegant, her bearing still regal, but today she looked fragile, porcelain stretched too thin. The weight of their secret had carved new lines around her eyes. "She'll hate us," he said. "Perhaps, but she deserves the truth." Eleanor lifted the tea tray, then set it down again, her hands trembling slightly. "James and Margaret raised her for 3 years, Thomas. 3 years. She crawled in their garden, spoke her first words in their cottage, learned to walk between their arms. And we gave her everything. The words came out harsher than he intended. Education, opportunities, a name that opens doors. We gave her a life they never could have provided. We stole her. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Thomas felt something break inside his chest, some final wall he'd built against the truth. Because Eleanor was right, of course. They had stolen Sarah. Stolen her as surely as if they'd taken her at gunpoint from the cottage where she'd lived with the grandparents who adored her. The fire had been their opportunity, the fire that burned the workers' cottages in the winter of 1978, when Thomas was young and desperate and consumed with the need to prove himself worthy of the Mitchell name. James and Margaret Hartwell had lost everything, including the legal documents proving their guardianship of their orphaned granddaughter. In the chaos of rehousing families and processing insurance claims, it had been easy enough to claim the child, to produce carefully forged papers, to present themselves as Sarah's rightful guardians. She'd been 4 years old enough to remember, but young enough to be convinced that her memories were dreams, that the elderly couple who haunted her nightmares were figments of a traumatized imagination. They'd told her that her parents died in the fire, that she'd been rescued and brought to the manor house. A simple story, a believable lie. The Hartwells had searched, of course. They'd come to the manor, desperate and grieving, demanding their granddaughter back. Thomas could still remember James's face, aged beyond his years, eyes hollow with loss. But what proof did they have? They were workers, peasants, nobodies. The Mitchells were everything they were not, wealthy, connected, untouchable. So the Hartwells had disappeared, and Sarah had grown up as a Mitchell, never knowing that the grandparents who loved her had spent 30 years in exile, their hearts broken not just by displacement, but by a more devastating theft. Until now. Until they'd returned to repair the church where Sarah had been baptized as a Hartwell, before she became a Mitchell. Until Thomas had discovered them and recognized the eyes that haunted his deepest shames. James's eyes, the same clear grey as Sarah's own. Eleanor moved to the window, standing beside him. They never stopped loving her, she whispered, all these years they never forgot. Margaret showed me pictures, newspaper clippings from Sarah's graduations, her wedding announcement, articles about her work with the children's charity. They've been watching from afar, proud of what she's become but never able to claim her. And now? Now they're dying, Thomas. James has cancer. Margaret's heart is failing. They came back to make peace with the place where they lost everything, not to reclaim anything. They don't want to hurt Sarah. Eleanor's voice broke. They just wanted to see the church restored, to know that something beautiful would remain after they're gone. Through the window, Thomas could see a car turning into the drive. Sarah, arriving to learn that her life was a lie, that her parents were thieves, that the elderly couple she dismissed as confused strangers were the grandparents who'd sung her lullabies and kissed her scraped knees. "It's time," Eleanor said. The rain hammered against the windows of Mitchell Manor as Thomas sat in his study, staring at the yellow documents spread across his mahogany desk. Each page seemed to mock him with its careful legal language, detailing how his grandfather had systematically stolen the Hartwell fortune through forged contracts and manufactured debts. The family empire he'd spent his life defending was built on lies. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from hours of silent contemplation. Sarah entered, her clothes still damp from the storm. "The Hartwells are waiting in the drawing room," she said quietly. "They agreed to come." Thomas nodded, running his hands through his greying hair. "How do I face them, Sarah? How do I look into their eyes, knowing what my family did to theirs?" "The same way they've faced every hardship for the past 60 years, she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "With dignity and courage." He found Eleanor and William Hartwell seated on the settee, their weathered hands clasped together. Despite their simple clothes and modest bearing, there was an unmistakable nobility about them that no amount of wealth could purchase. Thomas felt shame wash over him as he remembered his arrogant assumptions about their identity. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell," he began, then stopped. The formal address felt inadequate. "Eleanor, William, I don't know where to begin. Eleanor's blue eyes, so like his mother's, held no anger. Perhaps you could start by telling us why you wanted to tear down our church. Thomas sank into the chair across from them. I thought it was just an old building, a liability on my property. He gestured toward the documents he'd brought with him. I had no idea it was your family's legacy, no idea that my grandfather had stolen your land through fraud and deception. William spoke for the first time since arriving. We never expected to see those papers again. We thought they'd been destroyed long ago. Where did you find them? Eleanor asked. Hidden in a false bottom of my grandfather's desk, along with these. Thomas produced a small wooden box containing jewelry, pocket watches, and other personal items. I believe these belong to your family as well. Eleanor gasped as she recognized a delicate gold locket among the pieces. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. This was my grandmother's, and this picture, that's my mother with me as an infant. The weight of his family's crimes pressed down on Thomas like a physical burden. I can't undo what was done, but I can try to make it right. The land, the church, all of it should have remained yours. I want to restore your rightful ownership. That's very generous, William said carefully. But we're old, Thomas. We don't need vast estates or grand houses. We've made our peace with a simpler life. But your children, your grandchildren, we never had children, Eleanor said softly. The stress of losing everything, the years of struggle, it wasn't meant to be. The revelation hit Thomas like a blow. Not only had his grandfather's greed destroyed a family's fortune, but it had also stolen their future generations. The magnitude of the injustice left him speechless. However, Eleanor continued, there is something we would like, if you're truly willing to make amends. Anything, Thomas said immediately. Let us finish restoring the church. Let it stand as a memorial to all the families who've suffered losses they couldn't control. And perhaps, she exchanged a meaningful glance with William, perhaps it could serve another purpose as well. What do you mean? William leaned forward. We've watched you these past weeks, Thomas. Watched you struggle with learning the truth. You're not your grandfather. You have a good heart, even if pride has sometimes led you astray. Eleanor nodded. The church could become a place of healing, not just for our families, but for the entire community. A place where people can find forgiveness for themselves and others. Thomas felt tears threatening. You're offering me redemption when I should be begging for your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't something you have to beg for, Eleanor said gently. It's something freely given by those who've learned that holding on to anger only perpetuates the cycle of pain. As if summoned by some invisible signal, Sarah appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are others here who'd like to speak with you, Thomas. People from the village who heard about what you're trying to do. Through the window, Thomas could see a small group gathered despite the rain. Families he'd dismissed as unimportant. Workers he'd barely acknowledged. Neighbors he'd kept at arm's length. They were all waiting, perhaps ready to help heal wounds that had festered for too long. It seems, William observed with a slight smile, that redemption is rarely a solitary endeavor. Thomas stood, feeling lighter than he had in months. For the first time since discovering the truth, he could see a path forward, one that led not to destruction but to restoration. The morning sun cast long shadows across the churchyard as Thomas stood before the freshly painted doors, their white surface gleaming like hope itself. His hands trembled as he grasped the brass handles, feeling the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. Inside, Eleanor and Henry sat in the front pew, their weathered hands intertwined. They looked up as he entered, and Thomas saw in their faces the same mixture of love and loss that had haunted his own reflection for so many years. I've made my decision, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the restored sanctuary. The stained glass windows threw colored light across the wooden floors they had so carefully refinished together over the past month. Eleanor rose slowly, her eyes searching his face. Whatever you choose, Thomas, we understand. We've had more time with you than we ever dared hope for. But Thomas shook his head, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope and a set of keys. "The deed to the church property," he said, holding them out. "It belongs to you now, both of you." Henry's face crumpled, and for a moment Thomas saw the man his grandfather might have been if pride and fear hadn't driven him away all those years ago. "Son, we can't." "Yes, you can." Thomas stepped closer, pressing the documents into Henry's hands. "This is where you belong, where you've always belonged. And He paused, swallowing hard. "I want to belong here too, if you'll have me." Eleanor moved toward him then, her arms opening, and Thomas found himself enveloped in an embrace that felt like coming home. She smelled of lavender and old roses, and when she pulled back, her cheeks were wet with tears. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the church, at the altar they had rebuilt, the pews Henry had lovingly restored, the cross Eleanor had polished until it gleamed. "I want to hold Sarah's memorial service here, a real one, with everyone who loved her." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind chimes Eleanor had hung outside the vestry window. Thomas had spent the last week making calls, reaching out to Sarah's old friends, her colleagues from the hospital where she'd volunteered, the families she'd helped through her quiet charity work. "She would have loved that," Eleanor whispered. "She always said this place had the best acoustics for singing." Thomas smiled through his tears, remembering Sarah's voice filling their house on Sunday mornings as she prepared for church services she could never attend because of his stubborn pride. "Will you help me plan it?" "Of course," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll make it beautiful for her." The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted them. Through the windows, Thomas could see his business associates arriving for what they believed would be the demolition ceremony. His stomach tightened as he recognized the bulldozers pulling up behind the cars. "I'll handle this," he said, squaring his shoulders. But Eleanor caught his arm. "We'll handle this. Together." They walked outside as a group, and Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the strength that comes from not facing the world alone. His business partners stood clustered near their vehicles, looking confused by the church's obvious restoration. "Mitchell," called Robert Crane, his development partner, "what's going on here? This place looks like it's been renovated." Thomas stepped forward, Eleanor and Henry flanking him. "Change of plans, Robert. The church isn't being demolished. It's been donated to the Mitchell Foundation for Historic Preservation." The lie came easily, and Thomas made a mental note to actually establish such a foundation as soon as possible. Crane's face darkened, but Thomas continued before he could speak. "I know this affects our other projects, and I'm prepared to buy out your stake in those ventures at fair market value. My lawyers will be in touch." As his former partners drove away in varying states of anger and bewilderment, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The bulldozer operators, paid by the hour and indifferent to the change in plans, simply loaded up their equipment and left. "Well," Henry said with a chuckle, "that was easier than I expected." Thomas turned back to look at the church, seeing it now not as a symbol of loss, but as a bridge between past and future. "There's one more thing," he said. "I want to sell the estate, move into town somewhere smaller, closer to here." Eleanor's smile was radiant. "There's a lovely cottage for sale just down the lane, Mrs. Patterson's old place. It has the most beautiful garden." As they walked back toward the church, Thomas felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years. Not the crushing weight of grief, but the gentle warmth of love that endures beyond loss, beyond pride, beyond all the barriers that keep families apart. The church bells had been silent for decades, but somehow Thomas could hear them ringing.